A diorama undoubtedly brings a model to life and draws in non-modelers as it gives them a sense of scale and drama to a piece and has the ability to tell a story. It just so happens to be something I find extremely intimidating. So it was time to get uncomfortable and piece together a small vignette for this T34 I'd built a few weeks ago. 3D print technology has exploded of late and has certainly given us a whole new world to explore within this hobby. Sites like Cults 3D and GC Trader have great print-ready files for not a big investment, and after a short time I found a ready-made ruined street corner I felt would work with the scene I had in my mind. Given I'm relatively new to the discipline of building a diorama, this print would give me a head start and negate the need for creating something from scratch. Obviously creating something from scratch is the end goal, but for now I'm using this project as a chance to expand my knowledge with the printer. I'd love the figures I'd printed for the Vespered Tiger vignette I'd made a few months ago, and after a quick search I was able to find some Soviet soldiers to help add some drama and dynamic to this scene. Unfortunately, the way the base had been designed and the scene I'd had in mind were not going to align properly. I love the ruined street corner, however I'd need to replace the base section with something larger to house that tank and the figures I wanted to use. Using a rotary tool, I then removed the road sections from the building corner. Sanding and cutting resin is not a great idea in an enclosed environment, so be sure to use a respirator and eye protection if you're trying this at home. I had some blue insulation foam in my bag of tricks and went to work trimming it at a diameter of 140mm using my hot wire cutter. With the resin road section removed, I could then set my scene out and figure out where the main pieces of the story would all sit. I attached a couple of elevated sections as these would later represent my footpath. I was trying to avoid sculpting the foam because it is so unfamiliar to me, but was left with no choice as I had no other way of creating the cobblestone road for this scene. Rather than perfectly measure each row of stones, I took the plunge and started cutting into the foam using a sharp blade and a steel rule as my guide. I wasn't being too precise because some variation in these stones would make for a more interesting finish. I'm only going around 1.5mm deep, although if it was a little deeper it wouldn't really matter so much. I could then go back to the start and trim the perpendicular cuts and start to form my paving stones. I'm trying to avoid being too structured with the patterns because some imperfection will make for a more realistic look and add that level of interest to the section. By then using a toothpick, I'm able to broaden the cuts and start to soften the transition from the sharp, straight cuts to smooth but imperfect cobblestones. Each stone is similar but different enough to look realistic. The shapes for the pavers on the footpath were marked out using a different size stone from the road. This will help differentiate the areas and clearly define that space. I wasn't overly sold on how they looked at this point, but as with a lot of things we do in this hobby, we have to keep the faith and know it will be okay in the end, so I pressed on with the process. With all of the shapes sculpted, I then applied a layer of perfect plastic putty over the top of the roadway. A touch of water and the tip of my finger is used to distribute the putty over the road. The putty gently fills in those gaps and helps present the stones in a more realistic manner. The other thing it'll do is to help seal the foam and protect it against solvents that will be used during the weathering and painting stages. One of the things I enjoy with other people's work is the spaces that aren't completely obvious at first. The elements you need to explore to find. I wanted to add some interest into the inside of this building, but first the two halves of the building section were attached using a black super glue. A glue debonder was then used to clean up the excess glue from that joint. Once dry, I could then attach some beams to lay my floor using balsa wood. I'm only looking to create some structure rather than a structurally sound frame. The beams will give me something to rest the floorboards on as well. To make the floor, styrene sheet was marked up using a drafting pencil, and then the lines were scribed to give me the definition in the floorboards I was looking for. The piece I was using would give me enough material to cover both floors of the building. For the lower level, I wanted the floor to be intact and following the curve of the base. Producing that curve was as simple as using the base as a template and then trimming the curve to the shape. The same thing was done for the first floor, only this time I set about trimming into the ends with a pair of scissors to give the impression of damaged floorboards. The styrene sheet could then be glued in place and the building attached to the base using a PVA glue. I'm using PVA glue at this stage because super glue can react with the foam and it will essentially disintegrate it. You may also notice the pile of the resin rubble from the print is missing. It's been removed because I felt I could represent the pile of rubble in a more natural way. Irregular hunks of blue foam were torn off an offcut block I had and glued in place to create volume in that pile. I'm adding small pieces of balsa wood and trying to create a volume in that pile that looks plausible and natural. Once the glue was dried, the pile of rubble was further enhanced with a small amount of Sculptamold modelling clay. Sculptamold is a plaster product that is bulked up with a fine shredded paper. When mixed with water, it produces a plaster style of paper mache paste that air dries into a solid structure, but can then be cut, sanded and painted. The clay can be used to fill in the gaps in between those foam blocks and create some organic looking piles as the foundations for that rubble. A number of 70-second scale bricks I'd printed earlier were also embedded in that pile. The plaster mix is then used on the inside corners of the building to bulk up those areas where the rubble may fall and build up. While the plaster is still wet, I set some 3D printed furniture around the insides to help add that once lived in story to the scene. I've no idea where it came from, but I have a bag of generic rubble in the spares box. The mix has a variation of sizes and textures, but the brick sizes were clearly designed to be used for 1/35th scale, so the product was placed in a Ziploc bag and broken down by any means possible. To add further variation to that rubble mix, I added some garden soil, as well as a touch of coloured grout in a container and mixed it about. The Sculptamold paste had been left to dry overnight, which then allowed me to start adding some of the brick and debris. Mod Podge is a water-based adhesive similar to PVA glue and is first applied around the rubble pile in a controlled way. I'm wanting to maintain some of those angles that the foam pieces are giving me, as well as preserve some of the printed bricks, but I'm wanting to add an all-over texture with random lumps and bumps from that crushed rubble mix. The base layer of glue will hold this in position somewhat, but once I'm happy with how it is looking, a misting of isopropyl alcohol is applied over the stack, and then a misting of the glue mix follows. The isopropyl alcohol breaks the surface tension, which will allow that Mod Podge mix to flow more easily and fix everything into position. That glue mix is 1 part of the Mod Podge to 3 parts of water with a drop of detergent. The rubble mix is also used to enhance the internal sections, with the glue being applied in a slightly more controlled way using a pipette to apply that glue mix. Priming your model is always a good idea as it unites all surfaces and prepares the model for the painting phase. I primed everything using a Mr. Surfacer 1000 from the Rattle can. I was concerned the lacquer-based paint may damage the foam, but after testing it, found it worked just fine, and I made sure just to keep my coverage light just in case. I painted the bulk of the building in a light Dunkelgelb colour from the Atom range of acrylics. The colour looked close to reference images I'd seen and would give me a good base colour to build on. Brush painting white can be challenging due to its poor coverage, so a mask was applied with tape with the internal shapes of the decorative window surrounds being masked using a liquid mask product. I could then spray the white to these areas and get a good even coverage. The look certainly comes alive once the masking is removed. To set the foundation colours for this rubble, I'm going to use the colour of the primer as my base and introduce diluted washes of black brown, khaki, dark yellow, sand and a concrete colour. The acrylic paint perfectly thins down by simply using tap water. The surface of the model is moistened with a misting of water and the washes could then be applied. Using a soft brush, the various rubble tones are blended around the shapes. Because there is so much moisture in the paint and on the ground, the colour will tend to mix and blend and give me a more harmonious finish. But this is only a foundation layer and it's all about creating an overall tone. To help lift some of the raised areas in the rubble, watered down tones of light grey were applied using a fine brush. I then turned my attention back to the exposed brick and applied a base layer of brick red, and the floorboards were painted in a cork brown. Being one of my first attempts at a diorama like this, I was really excited with the possibilities for the inside of the building, but I was also conscious not to get too carried away with it given the scale. I printed a scaled down wallpaper pattern from the 1930s on my inkjet printer and trimmed it down into drops, just like wallpaper would be applied. The paper was then soaked in the glue mix from earlier and applied to the walls. I had a bit of fun with it and had some of the paper in disrepair and falling from the wall. The time spent in this area was certainly worth the effort. The cobblestone road was still the grey colour from the primer, which was looking adequate but was further enhanced using a whitened mix of light grey to selected stones. Tamiya buff was then used to add a layer of settled dust around the road and shapes created by that pile of rubble. This helps unite the tones and create a more cohesive look to that pile. A heavily thin mix of red, brown and black is used to apply shading around the pile as well as the shapes on the building. The shading instantly adds a tired and weathered look to the shapes, which adds that sense of despair to the building. Rubble and European earth are similar tones, but will work together well around the base to give me an organic look to the rubble pile. The pigment is first applied over the scene with a soft brush to move them around, and they were set in place with that glue mix I'd made earlier. Whilst the glue is still wet, I'm able to lightly dust the areas with the pigment by applying the powder using a tapping motion. The pigments are giving me another layer of texture in that pile. Again, the model is left overnight, and once dry I move to an enamel wash to help elevate some of the details such as the floorboards and the details around the damaged areas on the inside of the building. The detail around those windows pops with that wash, however I should have been more controlled with this application because the cleanup did take some of the base layer of that paint with it. The wash was also selectively used around the rubble and the road. A soft brush lightly moistened with white spirit is then used to move the paint in a downward motion, creating realistic looking streaking on the facade of the building. The front door was first painted in a light wood colour and 2 coats of chipping fluid applied with a top coat of blue. Soon after, the door was chipped by applying the water and gently rubbing at it with an old brush. The door was then superglued in place, although I later modified the position and added a doorknob using the end of a pin. The cobblestones needed a lift, so selected stones were painted using lighter tones of grey to help add some variation to that space. Most of the ground would be covered, but it's important to get these details right before moving past the stage. The window frames were painted brown and thin sheets of acetate were glued to them to simulate the glass. The acetate was scratched and trimmed into shapes to give the impression of broken glass, and the frames were then glued into the building section. Just having those details around the building made a huge difference to the overall look. I mounted the figures I'd printed earlier on cork using super glue to make them easier to handle during the painting process. The files I'd downloaded included bases, which made them easier to glue in place. I'd then be able to clip the figures at ground level and dispose of them at a later date. They were first primed in a Mr. Surface of 1500 black, and then cream Weiss was used to create the highlights using the airbrush. Following on with my tactic of painting the smaller scales a couple of shades lighter than I usually would, a glazed layer of Vallejo French tank crew was applied over the uniform sections. The glaze is designed to be semi-transparent in the hope that the highlights and the shadows from the shading will show through that colour. The glaze was made by mixing a glaze medium with the colour and adding a few drops of water. The details around the figure could then be painted using a fine brush. Buff and khaki tones for the equipment, and Cadian flesh tone for the flesh. Accuracy took a bit of a backseat, and I was painting the figures in such a way to help the detail lift due to its tiny scale. I applied a heavy-handed oil wash using shadow brown, again in the hope to expand that contrast in the colours to better help the small scale figure present nicely. The detail in the figure was enhanced by using a dry brushing technique to catch the edges and the shapes. Light flesh for the face and hands, and US Tanker highlight colour for the body. I did go back through and re-establish some of these high points using even lighter tones with a brush and a diluted mix of paint. Once the figures were dry, they were sealed in a matte varnish and they were ready to go. The figures weren't perfect and the detail was soft around the faces, but it would be enough to add that sense of scale and dynamic to the scene, which was the intention for including them. I'd also printed a couple of tank traps to visually pad out the scene. They were first painted in a black-brown colour and sponge chipped with lighter tones of a rust colour. It was a quick and easy way to add some decay and wear to those parts. I like my bases to present in a professional way and tell a brief story for the people who choose to read it. I first prepared the foam base by painting the edges in a black acrylic paint. This would obviously hide any edges where the print didn't cover, but it would also make the foam less porous, which will allow the adhesive from the print to adhere better to it. A basic design was created using text and historical photos and was printed on a thin styrene sheet. The styrene has a mounting film on the back side, and it was then simply a matter of wrapping the print around the foam base. Once I was happy with the final positions of those key elements, a touch of super glue was used to hold them in place. I should have addressed it earlier, but I made the call to add some straps to the soldiers' weapons. Thin lead foil from the top of a wine bottle was trimmed into thin strips and then attached to the guns with super glue and then painted. And that is where I thought the scene was complete, but then it hit me. The whole purpose of the bedspring armour was to defend against the Panzerfaust attacks during the Battle of Berlin. It would make perfect sense and complete the story of the diorama to have a German defender waiting for his opportunity to attack. I managed to find a figure that would work perfectly and set about painting and placing him in the scene. The addition of that figure felt right and took the display from a simple battle scene to an unfolding story that was about to play out. There is no doubting that a model presents a lot better when it's placed into a scene, as it immediately gives the viewer a sense of scale and drama, and it gives the non-modeling community a relatability which often opens the door to further discussion around the subjects and the hobby. I feel working in 70-second scale is a little more forgiving when creating a scene, and it would at least give me a feel for some of the materials and techniques employed in this area of the hobby. Funnily enough, once I was in the swing of the build, I found the process quite addictive and can definitely see something more elaborate in my future. They are time consuming though, and there is a lot to think about, but if building a diorama is something you've been thinking of doing, I'd strongly encourage you to have a go. You'll be glad you did. In other news, I'm proud to announce my Patreon page is now up and running, where there will be exclusive content as well as opportunities to connect and collaborate in different ways. Your support helps me cover the costs of producing this content and encourages me to bring you even more. If I've added some value today, please hit that like button and don't forget to subscribe, as it's helping me a lot. Remember guys, this is the greatest hobby in the world. Share it with your family, share it with your friends, and let's be proud of what we do. Until next time, I'll see you soon.